game-changing discussions on the big ideas that shape our thinking. This is One-to-One. Previously on One-to-One.
Across West Africa, across Africa, the reputation that Nigeria enjoys is the one of a very bold leadership. When Nigeria is challenged to provide leadership, it does so. And I think that is one thing that hasn't changed at all in Africa.
So I'd like us, therefore, to broaden it a little bit. There is no doubt about Nigeria's stature in Africa, hence the expectation. And we are doing quite a lot, as you said. But of course, we can compare ourselves with ourselves. But I'd like us to broaden it. And you touched on some other African countries, many of them quite small compared with Nigeria. I'd like to force a comparison here. Which African countries, in your judgment, are behaving strategically in this direction in terms of influence and leadership, apart from Nigeria?
No, well, I mean, I'm sure that you can count a few of them. South Africa would, be on top of this. But remember that South Africa's own foundations, are very exceptional in that regard. That for a long time in Africa south of the Sahara, South Africa was the one country that had a very solid industrial base. It was an industrialized society, had a very strong military and defense sector, had a strong mining sector, but most of all, had an economy that was very productive from within. And don't forget that at the point of a transition from apartheid, South Africa had also developed nuclear technology. So South Africa was in a very different, climate altogether. And therefore, you would expect that there will be continuity. Of course, there's change, but there's continuity from that foundation. And once you've had an industrial base, it's difficult to deindustrialize, for instance. So industrialization also means that your approach to strategic planning is different. Because when you become such a strong industrialized country, you are then thinking a little more rationally about how things, affect, themselves and so on. Now, but outside of South Africa, you can think of Egypt, which is, another old civilization that goes back to the era of the pyramids and so on. You can think of Ethiopia. These are historic civilizations that are not new to nation building and development and so on. Now, in that regard, I'm sure that students of comparative politics must rate Nigeria very highly. Because we don't have the historical coherence that many of these countries that I've mentioned had. We don't have the industrial advantage that a country like South Africa has. We don't have the productive capacities that some of these countries had. And unfortunately, these things have also affected the directions and trajectories of foreign direct investment. For instance, many of the major car producing manufacturing companies have plants in South Africa, in Morocco, and in Egypt. Morocco produces parts for Rolls-Royce, domestic production for Rolls-Royce. Now, these are very strong industrial bases.
Yes.
But we are getting there. The point is, who would ever have thought 30 years ago that we'll be at a point where we have the capacity to refine petroleum products? The derivatives, from that one industry, would see them. or that we have capacity to produce cement, or we have capacity to generate electricity in a diversified manner. Now, all of these things are happening because we have a reform process that is saying the state might be the leader, but it's not the only actor.
So have we just woken up after 30 years in that case?
In the past 30 years or in the future 30 years?
Now, with the reform agenda, have we woken up?
There's always room for a new foundation. And I think, that we will be failing as a country if we don't review, all the things that we've been doing. That's the dynamic part of planning, and especially strategic planning. And it's not different with Nigeria. I mean, we have to sit all the time, to look at where we are coming from, and where we want to be. And then we can recalibrate and reconfigure and do things and so on. But, I'm saying we are also self-conscious. We're self-conscious of the fact that other countries in Africa are also desirous of these leadership roles that we are playing. And that, we must jealously guard those advantages that we have.
So, Prof, I'd like you to hold that comparison in your head just for a minute, and let's recalibrate in this conversation. Just to be clear, in leadership terms, in terms of our discussion about leadership within Africa, what we're defining as strategic here is clear priorities, consistent execution, alignment, your words, of domestic and foreign policy. I'd like you to now reattempt that comparison.
Well, I mean, the point is, at any point in time, a country has to do a determination of its national standing and how that affects its external posture. Nigeria has had domestic challenges. You will remember that up until the 1970s, those domestic challenges took the major form of very serious divisions within the country. It was a time when, as a country, we had Nigeria ambassador in one country. We also had ambassadors from the Western region, from the Eastern region, and from the Northern region. Those forms of division were divisions of an international, a primitive international order. Now today, we don't have those kinds of divisions anymore. The challenges are a little more cross-cutting. They are economic, mostly. They are existential. These are serious problems, even of survival challenges. Poverty is very key. And therefore, the kind of foreign policy that we can pursue today must be the one that is capable of addressing these existential problems. We must deal with poverty. And the best way to deal with poverty is to have productive capacities, is to think of income distribution and redistribution, is to think of forms of social justice. All of these things will require economic empowerment. And government is saying, this is not something that we can do alone. We need a very robust private sector, and we need foreign investment. How do you make this place attractive for even domestic private sector investment? And this is the whole point. I mean, we must create an enabling environment, the ease of doing business, the kinds of reforms that we are doing, the infrastructural support that you would need. But most of all, we are also aware that if we don't make this place safe and secure, would at best have investors that come with their suitcases. So we don't want portfolio investors. We want, portfolio meaning that they come with, their portfolio of money and so on. We want investors that will come here and make this a productive base. And that's the whole point. So if we want to summarize what we're doing, how our domestic forces have compelled our foreign policy postures. That's clearly the thing. That we must solve our problems. And as I say, it was easier to do when you were politicking and trying to see how you could balance forces in the 60s, 70s, and so on. So if one side said, no, we don't support, what is happening in this part of the Middle East, another part says no, so you could have those kinds of dissensions. But today, there is agreement that if this country doesn't get it right economically, if we don't deal with poverty and insecurity, we are not going to get anywhere.
Correct. And I think you've hit the nail on the head here. The sum total, the summary, the balance of this argument really is that, yes, we've had a trajectory. We're not denying where we are or where we've come from. There's learning there. There's a reform agenda. That's great. But the thrust of our foreign policy agenda is domestic.
Yes, it's very pivotal.
That's the focus, and that it all makes sense. And let's look at the broader context. Let's look at the world in the context of what's been happening in Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East. The world appears to be hardening along the lines of power and interest. And you spoke earlier about a condensation and a constriction. What does that mean for countries with a policy of non-alignment? Is that strategic ambiguity tenable in this day and age, given what we now know the world is becoming?
I think that conceptually there's been a shift from whether you call it constructive or positive non-alignment to strategic autonomy. The point about strategic autonomy is that as much as is possible, every state, but especially the more vulnerable and weaker states, want to be able to take actions that serve their national interests. So they are not led by the nose by other countries. It's a form of non-alignment, but it's more discerning. It simply says we have to be strategically autonomous. But that comes with a different framework. Strategic autonomy means you must build your own, autonomy.
Absolutely.
From within.
Absolutely.
It means that you must, reduce the degree of your dependence. It means that, you must be able to do a lot of the things on your own.
Yeah, exert your agency at the very highest level.
Very good. Now, that becomes a policy goal as well as an instrument. So where we are today, the world is pushing everyone to the point of degrees of strategic autonomy. You are not responsible for the war in Ukraine, but the war affects you nonetheless.
Yes.
You don't know so much about the war in Iran, but see where every person is.
Absolutely.
A long time ago, we would have thought of strategic reserves and those kinds of things. Countries, responding differently because it's a war on the world. It's by other means. Yes. We won't call it a world war, but it's affecting everyone. Yeah. And so in some countries now, they have decided to reduce working days, work from home. There are now quotas. You can't buy more than X liters of petrol and so on. We're all responding differently. But I think this is pushing all of us to see that we cannot be isolationists. Yeah. We cannot undermine the multilateral platforms. The forces of the things that bind us together and make us collectively vulnerable are greater than the forces that make for individual interests and so on.
But where does this leave a previously non-aligned country while it's on that journey to strategic autonomy?
The point is, you must not forget that non-alignment had an ideological basis.
Correct. Yes. The world is changing, is what you
many of the things that we face today are not so ideologically driven.
Yeah, correct.
So you can be pragmatically non-aligned, meaning you are not for Ukraine, you are not for but there cannot be a consistency along those lines because the things that provoke these outbursts and the conflicts that we have don't follow very clear lines. Today, it's difficult to tell what exactly is at play. Is it the fact that Iran, is an aspirant nuclear power, even though Iran says we're already, in talks, how to get to good ends for all of us, and then this happens. So it's difficult to tell. But the point is that for Nigeria and for Africa and for the rest of the world that is at the very devastating receiving end, of these kinds of wars.
Of course.
We have to push, for ceasefire, for end of war, and for the return of a rules-based system and strong multilateralism.
So let's talk about how Africa has adapted, therefore, or is adapting. You suggested previously in our earlier conversation, I love referring to that conversation, that the West is becoming less reliable and that new powers were emerging. And we've spoken a lot about multilateralism here today. My question is this: has Africa adjusted fast enough to that reality? What is the evidence of a coordinated strategy to ensure we adapt properly?
This is a very difficult contemplation. Africa is not one country.
Correct.
Africa is a country, is a continent of 54 sovereign states. 54. And these 54 states are not equal. There are different levels of development, they face different challenges and so on. So, at best, theoretically, you can have an African response at the level where Africa is able to call the world to order and have a voice in these kinds of conflicts and push for peaceful resolution. But it is individual countries that have to respond, to the threats that are posed. For instance, petrol is very expensive all over now. There cannot be an African solution to that because Africa doesn't produce oil.
Of course.
So
let's boil it down to the level of African states, therefore. So when African states engage with China, the US, Europe, the Gulf, India, for example, is that strategic? Of course, it's strategic, but it's sometimes opportunistic as well. My question is this: what distinguishes the strategic from the mere opportunism? We know what's going on, for example, now in the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil. There's an opportunity for African states, including Nigeria. How do we make the distinction in the response between what is purely opportunistic and what is a coherent strategic response?
Remember the circumstances that led to the formation of OPEC. Now, here are oil producing countries, and then the question is, how do we make the best of this crisis?
Right.
So they got together to say, maybe our best way forward is to see that we can control the prices. And that's what OPEC has been doing.
Yeah.
Now, so in terms of, how those kinds of things can happen, we have to look at the opportunities. Now, it is difficult for Nigeria to act alone, at a time like this. Yes, we produce oil and so on, but that's very infinitesimal what we produce. In fact, today we also depend on imports, which means that we are almost as exposed as non-oil producing countries are. Now, these are global threats that require collective, efforts at addressing them. So this is not the time for individual countries to act alone. No one can be a champion of anything. It's the ability that they have to align forces with other countries and respond in a manner of a common interest-based, platform.
Which makes sense in this conversation, therefore, to pivot back to Africa.
Well, Africa is not an oil-producing country.
Indeed.
Africa is not an oil-producing region. There are a few African countries, you can count them. More are getting oil now. But I think, one of the lessons to learn from this, there was a time African oil-producing countries tried to get a parallel OPEC. African oil-producing countries had a platform, but it hasn't worked. Now we have critical minerals across Africa.
Of course.
In Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Rwanda, in Congo, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Niger. This is a time to get together. And I can tell you, these kinds of experiences that we are having now would push us more and more into making Africa more strategically autonomous. And look at this one. You know that one of the tragedies of resource mobilization in Africa is that our geological maps are not up to date. The geological maps that we use go back to colonial times in places to the 1920s and 1930s. So it is people who come from outside that are able to tell you, you have these resources, which you are not aware of. So it is time to build capacities to see how we can, all of us, work out frameworks, technological frameworks, geological frameworks that can help us do these things on a collective scale.
And that's not happening yet, is it?
We are too divided and we don't have the resources to do so.
I'm right up there with you with the high optimism. And I think you're absolutely right. The grain of point here is that there is work to be done if we're looking into a future like that. So here's my question, therefore. What would need to change in this country, concretely, not rhetorically, in the next 5 years, for you to say Nigeria is ready to assume the pole position that we all wanted to have in Africa?
If we have a strong defense industry, for instance, and it is something we can build from our present experience with insecurity. If we build a strong defense industry, then we'll replace oil and gas. If we build a strong service industry, a financial sector that is very strong, we'll replace oil and gas. And so the whole point about diversification of the economy is precisely about that. Now, think again what great assets we have when you have a Nigerian who's Director General of the WTO. When you have Nigerians, in such top positions. The Comptroller General of the Nigerian Customs is the chairman of the World Council of Customs. Now, those are, strategic positions that can be used, to arrive at, So what I'm saying is we can have those strategic deployments, but we must still give room for the unforeseens and the unknowns that sometimes become even more consequential. Suppose this war in Iran were to last for another 6 months. All of the plannings that we are talking about would come to naught. Because the first thing that you have to assume when you plan is that there's an ongoing society. There's a reasonable degree of stability, and so on. But where those things are not possible, then you have a problem. So I think the first thing is how to make our country more stable, how to stabilize the country. And that's what we're doing. And we think that, if we have an economic mainstay that can boost our productive capacities and enable us to get the right approaches to distribution, that would address poverty and so on, we have a good foundation.
Professor Osaghae, as the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, you are right in the middle of much of what is going on the foreign policy front in this country. You have a bird's eye view, I would say, of the entire thing. We've talked a lot here about how Nigeria and Africa ought to position itself, the geopolitical shifts that have occurred since our last meeting here 12 months ago. Can you tell me, from your point of view, from your particular vantage point, how is the NIIA positioning itself to support and assist this agenda that we've spoken about here today?
Well, know that the NIIA is the federal government's think tank and advisory on foreign policy and international affairs, which means that the NIIA has a responsibility to engage very robustly in not only discourses, but how those discourses can translate into positioning the federal government on the right track. And I think the NIIA has consciously gone about this mandate and has, driven the best that it can to make us where we are. The point I should make is foreign policy is not always about post hoc responses, meaning that foreign policy is more forward-looking and anticipatory, because once you're able to define what your priorities are, then you can navigate through processes. And therefore, the things that we see as, these are surprises and so on, become easier to deal with once you have the necessary tools to anticipate and know how to deal with them. One of the things that we have canvassed all the time is to have what we call strategic foresighting. It's a tool, that must be used.
Professor Eghosa Osaghae, thank you for joining me again on One-to-One.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.